Hello everyone, and thanks very much for joining me today, where I'll be painting up a Warlord Games British Infantry miniature as a Canadian infantry miniature. Today is actually the anniversary of the beginning of Operation Charnwood, the operations in and around the city of Caen, in which the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division participated during World War II. And I felt like using some of those Warlord Games British Infantry I had laying around to paint up some Canadians from the Normandy campaign. Of course, the uniforms are very, very similar, with a few differences I'll discuss as I go along here, so you should be able to use this fairly roughly as a guide for British infantry uniforms as well. Before starting, as usual, I recommend you wash off your miniature bits, your sprues and stuff, so that there's no demolding material on the actual miniature bits, the plastic, that'll prevent any paint from sticking. Then we'll go on with assembling and priming. Now, I've already based these miniatures a long time ago with some baking soda and cat litter over top of an old basing material, so it's a bit of a messy base, but whatever. I then went in with black Vallejo primer and just airbrushed it on. Now, you can use a brush to apply this, but if you do so, just watch out for making little air bubbles or having it pool in areas and obscure details. I'm then going to go in with a white acrylic ink through that same airbrush, and I'm just going to do a zenithal highlight. This helps highlight all the details for me and helps me see what I'm painting better, basically. You can do this by just dry brushing the miniature with a white paint. The last thing I'm going to do here is I'm applying some greenish color. I wanted this to be sort of a base color for the uniforms, but it was a little too green. And my understanding is the uniforms the Canadians had were made in Canada with a slightly different dye than the British in some cases for the older early war uniforms that maybe veterans would have had, and they were a little greener than British uniforms, so I'm going to try and build off that as I go along. Base coating the whole miniature, basically everything is done in brown. The skin, the uniforms, the wooden stock of the Thompson submachine gun, this is all going to be brown. Basically, it's pretty simple. The uniform itself, to get back that green, I mix some green into the brown and highlight the raised areas. Meanwhile, the Thompson stock, I'm going to mix some white into the brown and just add some very, very light wood grain. Keep your highlights on the uniform to the raised areas, the ridges and everything, and leave that brown sort of settling in the crevices to give it a little more definition. Going on with the skin, this is where I really sort of tried out some new stuff, and I'm most happy with this miniature. I wanted to make the skin really pop, because the rest of the miniature is largely drab, based on it being uniformed. For the skin itself, I use always some mixture of brown, yellow, and red paint. For the forehead, ears, and the hands, this is basically just brown, yellow, and red, brown heavy. For the nose and cheeks, I go a little more red heavy to give a rosy color. You'll see it's very, very red right now, but this is sort of our mid-tone, lower color. We're going to highlight this afterwards, and it'll look great. Trust me, I really like these. And then for the lower jaw, I go in and I add some blue, actually, to that mixture, which makes it look this kind of cold gray skin color, and that's for the stubble. In this particular case, I wanted them to look like veteran campaigners. You know, they'd been going Battle of Carpiquet Airfield all the way since, you know, landing on Juno Beach at D-Day itself. So a little bit of stubble, a little bit of a grizzled look to them seemed appropriate. So with those three sort of color areas on the face blocked out, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to highlight them. So we've got our sort of base coat of brown, we've now got a mid-tone, and now the highlight is each of the same color mixes, which is to say at the top area, a sort of brown heavy skin mix with a little bit of white and yellow in there to lighten it up. And I'm going to use that same one again for the hands. I'm going to highlight the knuckles and the ridges of the fingers. And then I'm going to go in over the nose and cheeks with that pinker color, but with a little bit of white and yellow mixed in to lighten it up. And I'm just going to highlight the ridge, sort of the laugh lines and the ridge of the cheeks and the very tip of the nose. This gives a little more definition, and you see now it's not quite as red looking in the large areas as it once was. I'm also going to go in and highlight the lips to make them pop out from that stubble area, and highlight the mouth. You know, he's yelling, he's got this sort of dynamic facial expression. I want to play off that, and I want that to still be visible at miniature scale. Then for the lower area, this is just that cool gray looking stuff highlighted up with some white and just applied very lightly on the ridges. I don't want to lose that gray sort of facial hair look, but I do want to highlight the edge of the chin and just make it pop a little bit more. Going back in here with an even more lightened, even whiter mix of that forehead and ear color, I'm going in and just touching the knuckles on the hands, just to give the hands a knobby, sort of more defined look at a long distance. This highlighting, this sort of 3-stage highlighting that I've been doing here, I've started doing that more and more with more of my models, and I'm really liking it as a quick way to, while the paint is on the palette, just build up that color in an area and make gradients that at tabletop distance are honestly, they look super smooth. Going in for the eyes, I'm going to use a really thick white acrylic so that I'm not having any runoff or anything on the tip of a very fine brush. I'm just going to poke in the eyes. You may want to use an off-white if you don't want the eyes to pop that much, but I just use straight white because it's such a small area. I actually do want them to pop out. And then I used a Pigma Micron fine liner, a drawing marker, to go in and do the pupils and sort of just touch up around the eyes if any of the white bled out of where I wanted it to be. These fine liners, the ink actually goes on really, really well over top of acrylic paint. So I recommend, even if you're not an illustrator, you look up something like a Pigma Micron. That's the name, Pigma Micron. And not sponsored, although, hey, Pigma, hit me up. Yeah, you can use those to dot basically anything or do any small details on a miniature. I've used them for small logos on, Battletech miniatures and stuff like that. So it's super useful that way. For the webbing itself, I'm using a sort of orangish, pinkish tan color. You'll see this ammo pouch doesn't necessarily look all that pink, but especially as I get around the webbing itself, I added a little more pinkish brown to it to just make everything look a little darker, and that way the highlights will pop out a little bit more. And also give it a little more dynamic color than just a tan, because tan's kind of a boring color on its own, particularly for details, and it can look really flat if you're just highlighting yellowish tan over yellowish tan. The highlights will look a little gray, I find. This goes over the pack as well, the knapsack and all elements of the webbing, just to color them up and get that base color on. Now again, we're going to go in with a highlight. This is the same color as we're using for the webbing itself, but in a paler sort of version, just adding some white in this case. You might want to add some yellow or something to just add a little bit of a color, because just adding white desaturates your colors a little bit, but because I used a pretty saturated reddish tan at first, adding in the white and desaturating it out actually works quite well here. And for this, I just try to touch the very edges of all of the webbing. On the pack here is probably the best example. I'm just writing all the edges, but because the pack has a big flat area that I want to break up, I'm also going to paint in just some ridges on that flat surface. Making it look a little wrinkled, because the pack's not a rigid material, right? It's clothy. So this just gives it a little more definition, and from a distance looks like there's more detail on this than there actually is. Don't forget the gaiters. I forgot the gaiters and I had to go back for them, but the gaiters themselves, I'm doing them the same color as the webbing, basically, so same color mixture. And when you do go in and highlight, just keep the highlights to the lower area of the gaiters, leaving the top area sort of shaded by the bloused pants above. And I find that made a really good sort of look to them, even though they are kind of a small detail just at the bottom. They do help sort of differentiate the color, the brown of the pants from the black of the boots. They're both dark colors, they don't sort of stand out that much, but the gaiters, they're a great little detail for breaking those apart. The hand grenades, I just used a sort of darkish olive green over top of the hand grenades, green base coat that we'd applied a while ago. And this sort of gives us the base color for them. You could leave it that way if you want to, but like everything else, I'm going to say just take that same color that's already on your palette, put a little bit of white in, and we're just going to dot all of those ridges on the grenades, the pineapple dots, if you will, just to make the grenades look a little more defined, because from a distance they're just going to kind of look like green blobs if you don't do this little highlighting step. And it is very quick. Going in this way, you get a nice little detail on the vest. As for the equipment, you might be wondering right now, he's supposed to be a squad leader, an NCO, so he's got the submachine gun, he's got the grenades, whatever. That was just how I envisioned it anyway. The black colors, this is going to be mainly for the boots and for the Thompson submachine gun itself. The astute among you will notice that the Thompson submachine gun was already colored in the previous clip, and now it is uncolored. That's some pretty cool editing magic. I'm just flipping around my workflow a little bit to make it make more sense. Because I actually painted the boots and sort of forgot. I was bouncing around a little bit between things while I was doing the webbing. But it might make sense for you, especially if you don't have a wet palette, though if you don't have a wet palette, you should check out my video on that. It's pretty easy to make and it's quite useful. But it might make more sense for you to just do all the black areas at once, so boots and submachine gun and whatever, while, leaving the webbing to a later time, or previous time, whatever. Just doing it all at once. I want to show all of a particular area getting painted at one time. The other thing is, for the black, you might want to use a gunmetal if you want it to look a little shinier or something, or use a gray instead of a black to give a little more definition to it. You could also go in and just highlight with a dark gray to make the areas of the Thompson submachine gun more distinct, though I would argue there's not that much black to it, so there's not that much to highlight. And in my case, with a fairly wet black paint, it just sort of flowed into the recesses and left the raised areas a little more defined anyway. For the helmet itself, I'm using sort of a brownish green, but more brown than green in this case, and I'm just going over the whole area. You can see it's pretty watered down. I'm not going to worry about that too much, because it's flowing into the recesses, yes, but that's fine, because the top of the recesses is that web, the webbing material on top of the helmet where you can attach your scrim, which is to say your camouflage. I'm just going to dry brush that now with a sort of tan color to make it stand out a little bit more. I've mentioned dry brushing once before in this video, but I'm just going to say now, if you don't know what dry brushing is, I actually do have some examples in earlier videos on this channel, but dry brushing is basically just taking some paint, putting it on your brush, and then rubbing the brush off on a porous material like paper towel or wood or something, just to draw off all of the paint from the ends of the bristles and only leave it at the recessed areas. So if you have a highly textured area like that webbing, and you draw the brush over it, it's only going to apply the paint that's in the recesses of the bristles, which means it's only going to touch the highest areas. And therefore just highlight those. It's a pretty quick, easy way to highlight something that has a lot of texture for you. For the mud around his feet, this is just a brown ink. I think it's an India ink, brown. Nothing crazy here. I'm just making it all look like mud. You see what I mean when I mentioned earlier that these models have been based a long time ago, and then I tried rebasing them by putting on some baking soda, super glue, and cat litter. And it made it look like he's standing in sort of a puddle or little smallest shell crater in the world or something. Yeah, it's fine. Once we apply the grass, it kind of just looks like he's standing in tall grass. One thing I will say is by applying the green with the airbrush, I did kind of ruin the fact that the little cat litter pebbles, if you leave them gray, which is to say black primer and then white zenithal highlight, they actually look just like pebbles. They're gray. So you can just leave them unpainted at this stage. But for this case, I covered everything up because the green didn't look that great. The badges on the character, these are a little hard to do if you've got sort of unsteady hands like me, but there's just a couple that you need to put on. The first is the 3rd Canadian Division formation patch. This is just a cool sort of bluish gray that you could put on sort of midway down the upper arm, I guess. In this case, I left the center unpainted because there was a fold in the fabric there and I wanted the shading to show through. Below that, with an orangish tan, I applied 2 chevrons to signify there's a corporal and NCO in the game. And then at the very top of the shoulder is the regimental patch. So the regimental patch is, in this case, for the Régiment de la Chaudière, burgundy. So I just took some red and added a little bit of blue just to make it darker and deeper, and just line the top of the shoulder. Now, there might be decals for this sort of stuff, but I didn't want to buy decals. I wanted to try painting it all on, and it looks pretty good, to be honest. So I'm quite happy with that. The Régiment de la Chaudière patch here stands out quite well in that red. Finally, we're getting onto the basing, the flocking for the bases, more specifically, since the basing material, I guess like the sand and rocks, is already put on. But the flock I'm going to be using, it's just a mixture of some Woodland Scenic static flocks, 2 different ones, I think medium green and dark green or something. Some oregano to make little leaves, some dill to make sort of different colored grass, and maybe some clump foliage, some little clump stuff. It's like sponges that are broken up. Anyway, I mixed a bunch of stuff together to give some definition and not just make it one color of static grass anymore. For the glue, I use Mod Podge. I have tried using other white glues. However, the other white glues that I tried, though they were advertised as drying translucent, they didn't dry completely transparent, which means there's still a little cloudy gray under the grass, which isn't super nice. I haven't had that issue at all with Mod Podge. Mod Podge dries perfectly clear whenever I use it for this, so I do recommend Mod Podge for your use as well. Taking the flock, I grab a big old pinch of it, and I just apply that, sort of dabbing it on and dropping it on and whatever, trying to make sure that as much of it as possible is standing up, so the grass looks, you know, like standing up vertical grass and not all tamped down. Then just tap it off afterwards, let it all fall in. Try to make sure that you don't get too much stuck to the miniature, because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to varnish it. Now, I didn't film that. Filming my airbrushing setup's kind of tough, and the video didn't turn out. But I applied a matte varnish to him, just to finish it off and make the glossy edge of especially the inks go away, so that everything looks like flat colors. It just helps a lot, in my opinion, with the appearance of the miniature. And once the varnish is done and set, I'm going to go in with this black flow acrylic around the edges of the bases. Now, black flow acrylic, this is just there's big bottles of it that are sold at my local art store, Michael's, for pretty cheap. It's basically just pre-watered down black acrylic paint, and it's pretty convenient. I like that it goes on, it leaves a glossy finish, and because it's a flow acrylic, so it's already watered down, it sort of settles and smooths out, so brush strokes don't stay. I can really just roughly apply it, you know, and then walk away, and then it comes back, and it's a smooth, black, glossy finish to the edge of the base. Brilliant. So if you can find that, I recommend that as well. So the miniature is now finished, and that's it. That's our Canadian NCO from the Régiment de la Chaudière. It's a pretty simple paint job. You saw that I painted up actually a little fire team. I had the picture at the beginning of the video there. All in the same way, all using the same techniques. I got different finishes on the camouflage every time because of the base with green, go on with brown, highlight with green. It was kind of weird, to be honest, but I did get several of them done, and it was pretty quick. The biggest thing I'm proud of right now, like this, the faces, right? Like they are, in my opinion, much better than previous faces I've done, at least in terms of color definition and just detail. Like they look more expressive, they look more interesting because of the stubble. I need to work on ways to define without the stubble, and you know, that's the next step. But for now, I'm really, really happy with how these turned out, and I hope you are as well. I hope you learned something from this video, and it was interesting and fun to you. If it was, then feel free to leave a comment, like the video, please, subscribe, any of that stuff. That's all very, very helpful, and I really, really like seeing it. It's super cool to see that you know, people outside of my immediate friend group are interested in what I'm doing. So thank you very much for expressing your interest and following along. If you have any questions about what I do, leave them in the comments as well. And with all that being said, thanks again for watching, and go play some games.